How did a crooked New Orleans police officer end up ordering a hit on a mother of 3? Len Davis, also known as Robo, was once seen as a protector patrolling the streets of the 9th Ward. But behind his badge, he was leading a double life, working with drug dealers and using his power to silence those who stood in his way. The story of Davis's rise and fall is one of corruption, betrayal, and a system that finally caught up with him. This is the chilling tale of how a man sworn to uphold the law became its most dangerous threat. Len Davis was not born in New Orleans, but by the time his name became infamous, the city had fully embraced him as one of its most controversial figures. Born in Chicago in 1964, Davis moved to New Orleans with his mother after his father's untimely death. The Crescent City was a far cry from the Midwest metropolis, its streets teeming with vibrant culture, but also plagued by crime, poverty, and corruption. Davis's entry into the New Orleans Police Department, NOPD, came at a time when the city was desperate to find officers willing to patrol some of its most dangerous neighborhoods. Davis's early life was unremarkable. After high school, he worked for several years driving a candy truck. He also had a brush with the law, collecting battery charges along the way. At the age of 22, Davis enrolled in the NOPD's training academy, hoping to trade in his mundane life for something more powerful. The NOPD, already struggling to keep up with the rising crime during the crack epidemic and the white flight out of the city, was hungry for recruits. The standards were lowered, and the training process became far less rigorous than in years past. Despite some early trouble in the academy, where Davis was temporarily kicked out, he found his way back in. In '88, he graduated and joined the force. It wasn't long before his reputation for toughness began to grow. His large, intimidating frame made him a natural enforcer on the streets, and it earned him the nickname Robo. But while some viewed him as an officer who would stop at nothing to keep order, others feared him, particularly in the Desire housing projects where Davis was often stationed. He was also called the Desire Terrorist by those who saw him not as a protector but as a menace. The Desire housing projects were among the most dangerous in New Orleans, a place where violent crime was rampant and drug dealers ruled the streets. Davis quickly made a name for himself here, not only for his aggressive style, but also for his willingness to get deeply involved with the criminal underworld. As a patrolman in the NOPD's 7th District, Davis found himself in the heart of New Orleans' burgeoning drug trade. It wasn't long before he was involved in protecting the very criminals he was sworn to take down. But even as complaints piled up, allegations of brutality, intimidation, and abuse of power, Davis was able to maintain his position. Between 1987 and 1992, he faced 20 formal complaints, ranging from physical abuse to corruption, yet he remained untouched. In fact, in 1993, Davis received the NOPD's Medal of Merit for bravery after being shot in the line of duty while chasing armed suspects. The contradictions in his career were stark. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was a ruthless figure, using his badge to exert control through fear. The seeds of Davis's criminal empire were planted early in his career. He began to align himself with local drug dealers, not as an adversary, but as a protector. He helped these dealers move product, covered up violent crimes, and ensured they could operate under the safety of his authority. The line between officer and criminal blurred, but in a department as corrupt as the NOPD in the 1990s, Davis was not an outlier. How did Len Davis go from enforcing the law to becoming one of the most dangerous figures in New Orleans' criminal underworld? By the early 1990s, the New Orleans Police Department was drowning in corruption. Officers were overworked, underpaid, and many had begun to find ways to supplement their incomes through illegal means. Len Davis, a towering figure in the department, saw an opportunity to make money while climbing the ranks. His aggressive reputation and his willingness to go to extremes quickly set him apart from his fellow officers. But it wasn't just his size or strength that made him feared. It was his ability to navigate both the world of law enforcement and the criminal underworld with ease. Davis was stationed in the Desire Projects, one of the most dangerous and drug-infested areas in New Orleans. Instead of bringing law and order, he became part of the problem. He saw the thriving drug trade and realized he could profit from it. For the dealers in the area, Davis wasn't just a cop. He was protection. In exchange for money, he would look the other way. He gave them safe passage, ensured their operations ran smoothly, and when necessary, he would handle any threats to their business. As Davis grew more comfortable with his role as both a police officer and a criminal enforcer, his actions became bolder. He started taking a cut of the profits from the drug trade. His badge gave him power, and he used it to instill fear in both the citizens of the Desire Projects and even within the ranks of the NOPD. His reputation as a corrupt officer was well known, but fear kept his fellow officers silent. No one dared to confront him or question his actions. The police department itself was crumbling under the weight of corruption. Low pay and poor working conditions had turned many officers towards moonlighting or working security jobs to make ends meet. But for Davis, moonlighting wasn't enough. He wanted control. He wanted power. And the Desire Projects gave him the perfect playground to expand his influence. He began building alliances with other officers who were willing to look the other way for a share of the profits. Together, they ran protection for the criminals of New Orleans. Davis's actions weren't just about money. They were about control. He used his position to create a network of corruption within the NOPD. He manipulated officers. He protected criminals. And he silenced anyone who tried to stand in his way. As his power grew, he became more ruthless. The line between law enforcement and criminal activity blurred beyond recognition. Davis was no longer just a cop. He was a kingpin. But with power came arrogance. Davis believed he was untouchable. He had built his empire through fear and intimidation, and he had no reason to believe anyone could take it from him. The Desire Projects had become his domain. He was no longer enforcing the law. He was controlling the streets through a mix of fear, money, and violence. The corrupt environment in the NOPD gave Davis the freedom to act with impunity. His actions went unchecked as he protected drug dealers, took bribes, and manipulated those around him. He had become a master of both worlds, a cop by day and a criminal by night. And as his empire grew, so did the fear he instilled in those who crossed his path. Yet even as Davis sat at the top of his corrupt empire, there were whispers. Whispers of investigations and eyes watching from the shadows. But Davis paid them no mind. He believed he had complete control over New Orleans and nothing could bring him down. For now. Kim Groves was a mother of 3 living in New Orleans' 9th Ward. She wasn't involved in the drug trade, she wasn't a criminal. She was just trying to live her life and raise her children in a neighborhood plagued by violence and corruption. But in October 1994, her life would be cut short in a brutal and senseless act of violence orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Kim's story begins on the streets of the 9th Ward, where she witnessed something that no one should ever have to see. One day, she saw Len Davis and his partner Sammy Williams beating a young man they had mistaken for a suspect in a police shooting. The young man was pistol whipped and left bloodied and bruised. Kim knew this was wrong. She knew the police weren't above the law, and so she did something that most people in her neighborhood would never dare to do. She filed a formal complaint against Len Davis with the New Orleans Police Department. For a mother of 3, filing a complaint against a corrupt police officer was an act of extraordinary courage. In a neighborhood where the police were often as feared as the criminals, Kim stood up against the system. She wanted justice. But what she didn't know was that her brave act would set in motion a series of events that would lead to her demise. Davis was known as RoboCop in the streets. His large frame and aggressive policing style had earned him a reputation as someone who couldn't be crossed. And when he heard about Kim's complaint, he saw it as a threat to his power. He couldn't allow anyone to undermine his authority, especially not someone from the community he controlled through fear. Through the NOPD's internal system, Davis was tipped off about Kim's complaint by another officer. Furious, he decided to eliminate the problem. In his mind, Kim wasn't just a witness. She was a threat to his entire operation. The next day, Davis made a call to Paul Hardy, a local drug dealer and hitman who had been working with him for years. Davis gave Hardy a description of Kim Groves. He told him exactly where she could be found, and he made it clear what needed to be done. On October 14, 1994, just one day after Kim filed her complaint, Hardy approached her on the street near her home. She had just left her house and was walking when Hardy came up to her. As she looked up at him, perhaps thinking he was someone she knew, Hardy pulled out a gun. He fired one shot at Kim. She was unalived within minutes. Kim Groves wasn't involved in any criminal activity. She was just a mother, a neighbor, a citizen who wanted to make her community safer. But in the corrupt world of Lynn Davis, her life was expendable. Her murder was cold and calculated, ordered by a man who wore a badge and took an oath to protect the very people he destroyed. After Kim's death, the neighborhood was filled with fear. People whispered about what had happened, but no one dared to speak out. Everyone knew Davis was behind it. They knew what he was capable of. If he could silence Kim, what could he do to anyone else? But what Davis didn't know was that his empire of fear and corruption was starting to unravel. The murder of Kim Groves would not go unnoticed. This time, the consequences of his actions would be far greater than he ever imagined. By the time Kim Groves was unalived, the FBI had already begun to take a close look at Lynn Davis and his corrupt dealings within the New Orleans Police Department. Whispers of his involvement in illegal activities had been circulating for months, and Operation Shattered Shield was well underway. The investigation had started small, with agents gathering bits and pieces of information about corrupt officers. But when the name Lynn Davis surfaced repeatedly, it became clear they were dealing with something far more insidious than they initially thought. Davis had built an empire within the Desire Projects, a neighborhood riddled with drugs and violence. He had become the protector of drug dealers, ensuring their operations went undisturbed in exchange for a cut of their profits. To the criminals, Davis wasn't just a cop, he was an ally. To the residents, he was a figure to be feared, someone who could decide the fate of anyone who crossed him. His badge provided him with the ultimate cover, allowing him to walk the line between law enforcement and organized crime with ease. Operation Shattered Shield aimed to expose the deep-rooted corruption within the New Orleans Police Department. The FBI knew they needed more than just rumors to bring Davis down. They needed solid evidence. So they began tapping phones and planting undercover informants. Over time, they collected hours of incriminating conversations between Davis and his criminal associates, most notably Paul Hardy, the man who had unalived Kim Groves at Davis's command. The recordings captured Davis orchestrating drug deals, advising on how to carry out crimes without getting caught, and openly discussing the protection he provided to the criminals under his watch. He spoke with a level of arrogance that suggested he believed he was untouchable. In one conversation, Davis was heard laughing about the murder of Kim Groves, bragging about how she got what she deserved for filing that complaint against him. The callousness in his voice was undeniable. But Davis didn't stop at protecting drug dealers. He began using his position within the NOPD to control nearly every aspect of criminal operations in the Desire Projects. His control extended beyond just keeping drug dealers safe. He was advising them on when to strike, how to hide their activities, and how to deal with anyone who posed a threat to their business. It was clear that Davis had crossed far beyond the boundaries of corruption and into the realm of orchestrating criminal enterprises. As the FBI listened in on more calls, they realized they had enough to bring Davis down. His involvement in the murder of Kim Groves was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about using his power as a police officer to commit and cover up murder. In the days leading up to their move, the FBI watched as Davis continued his regular patrols through the Desire projects, completely unaware that his time was running out. To him, everything was business as usual. He collected his payments, made his rounds, and ensured that the drug trade continued to thrive under his protection. But the walls were closing in. The FBI had gathered more than enough evidence to charge him with conspiracy, murder, and a slew of other crimes that would ensure he would never wear a badge again. The next step was to take him down, and they knew it had to be quick and decisive. On a rainy October day in 1994, as Davis made his usual rounds in his police cruiser, the FBI moved in. Agents surrounded his vehicle, catching him completely off guard. For the first time in years, Lynn Davis realized he was no longer in control. As Davis was arrested, the residents of the Desire projects watched in silence. The man who had ruled their streets with fear was finally being taken down. But for the FBI, this was just the beginning. There were more officers to investigate, more corruption to expose, and more stories like Kim Groves is waiting to be told. By the time Lynn Davis felt the cold steel of handcuffs bite into his wrists, his empire of fear and corruption had already begun to crumble. For years, he had walked the streets of New Orleans with an air of invincibility, shielded by his police badge and his reputation as RoboCop. But as the FBI closed in, Davis, once seemingly untouchable, was about to face the consequences of his actions. The FBI had spent months building their case, listening to wiretapped conversations, trailing his every move, and connecting the dots between his corruption and the countless crimes he facilitated. Davis wasn't just another dirty cop. He was orchestrating a criminal network that included drug trafficking, extortion, and even murder. The murder of Kim Groves, which had sent shockwaves through the city, became the linchpin in the FBI's case. On the morning of October 5th, 1994, federal agents made their move. Davis had just finished his patrol, unaware that this day would mark the end of his reign. The takedown was swift and executed with precision. Unmarked FBI cars surrounded his vehicle as Davis drove through the Desire projects. Agents, guns drawn, ordered him out of his cruiser. The man who had terrorized these streets was now powerless. His disbelief was clear. How had it all come to this? As residents of the Desire projects watched in silence, Davis was taken into custody. The streets, once under his control, now bore witness to his downfall. Along with Davis, his close associate and hitman Paul Hardy was arrested within hours. The FBI had secured enough evidence to dismantle the entire criminal network that Davis had built within the New Orleans Police Department. Inside the FBI's New Orleans office, agents reviewed the fruits of Operation Shattered Shield. Davis had used his badge to commit unspeakable acts, and his arrest sent a powerful message that even the most corrupt could be brought to justice. Later that day, Davis sat in an interrogation room as agents laid out the charges against him. Murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking were just the beginning. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and yet Davis remained silent. His defiance never wavered. In '96, Davis was convicted on 2 federal civil rights charges for ordering the murder of Kim Groves and for witness tampering. Initially sentenced to death on April 26, 1996, Davis managed to avoid execution for a time when his death sentence was overturned by the Fifth Circuit due to issues with the witness tampering conviction. However, a subsequent jury reinstated the death penalty, and on October 27, 2005, Davis was sentenced to death again. He now sits on federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Paul Hardy, who carried out Groves' murder on Davis's orders, was also convicted of conspiracy to violate Groves' civil rights and witness tampering. Hardy initially received a death sentence, but in 2011, his sentence was commuted to life when he was deemed intellectually disabled by a judge. Despite the convictions, the impact of Davis and Hardy's actions left a lasting stain on New Orleans, serving as a painful reminder of the city's darkest days of police corruption. News of Davis's arrest spread quickly, and for the people of New Orleans, it felt like a long-awaited reckoning. The man who had ruled with an iron fist was finally brought down. The streets that had once been filled with fear now felt a little lighter. For Lynn Davis, however, this was only the beginning of a long road through the justice system. His fall from grace was not just a personal failure. It was a symbol of how deeply corruption had seeped into the very institution meant to protect and serve. His name, once synonymous with power, would forever be linked to betrayal, crime, and the ultimate downfall of one of New Orleans' most feared police officers.